Good morning, everybody. It's great to see all of you again after a short break. And we're going to dive back into the book, So You Want to Talk About Race. And we are ready to start on chapter 9, which is entitled, Why Can't I Say the N-Word? And so, again, I'm just going to start with a quote like I've done with the others. And I chose a quote on page 139. It's about halfway through the chapter, I think. And she says, in our history of racism, words have had a starring role in the brutalization of people of color. Beyond the N-word and beyond Black America, words have been used in the oppression of many races. I will not use those words here because I am a Black woman and I do not feel comfortable invoking the painful history of words used to oppress Native American people, Asian American people, Latinx people, and more, when my community has not had to suffer the consequences of how those words have been used to justify genocide, internment camps, and more. But looking at American history, words have been used to separate, dehumanize, and oppress. The power of those words is still felt today. So I'll offer that to start our discussion, and then we'll go wherever you would like.
I'll get it started. I thought that it was a pretty important distinction that she made about the power of the N-word compared to calling a white person a cracker. Mm-hmm. That how it doesn't carry that kind of weight. It's an individual moment for me, might hurt my feelings a little bit, but it doesn't carry the sociocultural weight and all that history.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that white people quite get that. I think then they want to say, well, it's reverse discrimination or something to that effect. I think it was an important distinction to make.
I agree, Todd. I think that section was extremely powerful for me too.
I think as a follow-up to that, one of the things that I liked was just that mention of the feeling of your gut. You know, when you're saying these words out loud, as she asked you to, that feeling, that's invoking all of that history, and that's a totally different feeling, you know, than as Todd alluded to, that the word cracker gives when it's being said. And then moving into the quote that Dr. Monroe shared, you know, that there's such impact behind all of those different races and different cultures and the connections of, you know, things that have happened in regards to those and all of those different words, and her just saying, I'm not even going to add to that, which I thought was meaningful as well.
I thought it was interesting. I was looking through the book, you know, now to see that she didn't mention like lyrics in rap songs, and how, although the word is phrased differently because they take the ER off and make it the A, you know, that, in my opinion, has encouraged many people, white people, Asian people, whoever's into the music, to use that word, which is really the same word, even though they've changed it around. You know, so when I looked through there and I didn't see where she had really talked about that. And I think that that's an issue because it's in all of the songs. I teach Zumba and other dance fitness classes, and I have to look for clean versions all the time. And even the clean versions have that word in it. And I'm like, well, I can't use that because I'm not going to perpetuate use of the word in my class, you know, in my dance classes. So I just thought that was interesting because I don't recall in there, and I can't find that she ever mentioned that it's in mainstream music.
I don't think she does, Diane. And there's the YouTube channel, Conversations with a Black Man, I think is the YouTube channel that launched a few weeks ago. One of his first videos was on that very topic, and the video was really interesting, but then the comments on the page were so insightful. And I mean, I don't usually recommend reading comments on a web page. That's not normally good for your learning and mental health. But I thought these were, for me, it was really helpful to understand just the depth of pain that those words can cause and have caused and do cause. And so you're right. She doesn't talk about that. And I wish she had. I think it's a miss.
In the quote that you began with, that phrase brutalization of people of color to me sticks out because it's essentially it's a classification system created by, or at least initiated by, white people. And I think what's maybe connected to that is that it creates not just a classification, but basically a separation and sort of a subservient level to everyone else by classifying and diminishing entire cultures based solely on skin tone, pigmentation. And I think there's a lot of history that isn't shared enough, but there's just not enough, I think, willingness to look beyond that and accept these widespread acceptance of terms. I feel does kind of cross over into our pop culture, like like I think Diane was saying, but it doesn't stop with just that one word or its modified spelling. In music, it happens a lot. It's used in television and films, and it's meant to capture the real America, but we're only perpetuating that problem if we don't kind of stand up against the use of it.
Yeah, and Quentin Tarantino films, I mean, that's like his favorite word. And I'm not a big fan of his, but goodness gracious, you're going to need to come up with another word to use in your films.
That's the thing, is it's this essence of wanting to create this reality, but is this the reality we want to broadcast, even still?
I was wondering, I have, not that I buy into this, but I have heard some discussion about this, that means that they're owning the word and using it on their own terms in the music and that kind of thing. And I'm using the example, my daughter is, LGBTQ, and they use the word queer, and I cannot stand that word. And she says, well, we're owning it now, and it's our word. We're taking it back.
I've heard that as well, and I think that is true. I think they are owning the word, and I think it's different. I do believe it's different when Black people say it in either format, but as I said, with the A on it, I get it. It's a term of endearment, supposedly. But if you're putting that in music and in films, then the people that admire your work are also going to use it. It's not uncommon now. I've seen young people who are not of color, and they say, "What's up, and they're both white. And I'm like, when did that start happening? I mean, I was like, wait, what? And so I was talking to some of my friends who teach in, the high school and grade school level, which I've never taught at that level. And they're like, oh yeah, they say that all the time. Okay. That was new information for me. So they see it as being cool, and I get it. They see it as being cool, and they're using it as endearment too. And they, this is all good, but I don't know. I mean, that's the message that people are getting now, young people mostly. And, how do you resolve that with the historical meaning of that word?
I taught high school for a little while. Let me just jump in really quickly. And I'm not necessarily taking that particular word. If I had a kid slip of anything that's considered, vulgar, I would try to express them as nicely as I could, that it's actually very easy to remove a word from your vocabulary, almost as easy as it is to add a new one. So, you can consciously just stop using it and not justify using it very easily.
And
Diane, kind of stood out to me and surprised me a little bit in regard to the words in this chapter. It says on page 139, for people who have the old school book like I do, words like ghetto, nappy, uppity, articulate, and thug. Some of those I think are very clearly referring to race, but things like uppity and articulate, I wouldn't have necessarily. I mean, if you were talking about it in a racial context, but if somebody just used those uppity and articulate, I don't know that I would have immediately thought, oh, that's a racially charged word. So that was something very interesting for me to read, that those were words that would have that sort of same power as well.
I don't see articulate as that way. And I've heard people of color say to me, they see it that way. I don't see that word that way. Uppity, that's like snooty to me. But I get, honestly, when you're someone who comes across a certain way, uppity, if you're Black, does mean that. And I've heard that a few times. So I get it. I know that that's what that means. But articulate, I don't see that as a racially charged word. So I disagreed with her in that
I think it can probably be in the way in which you're using it too.
Mm-hmm.
If you're saying that, a person of color is articulate and you have this surprised tone to your voice. That's how a friend explained it to me once, when we were talking about words like that. And I get that. I mean, I would take offense to that if somebody were surprised that I were a good leader because I'm a woman or something like that. And that happens all the time. So.
And I think that can be with any word then.
Yeah.
Like they could look at me and say, wow, you're kind of smart, for, you can do that with any word, so I guess I put it in that same category.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where I've heard the word articulate, and there's been different words, is actually for me been when I've been with other white people and they're describing somebody of color.
Mm.
Like, have you met so-and-so? No, I haven't met so-and-so. Well, he or she, they actually really speak good English. Or that also happens with the, Latinas and that sort of thing. So maybe it's just a kind of encapsulated in certain parts of the white community. I've got a neighbor right down the street that they just had some painting done, and there was all kinds of talk because the people that came to do the work didn't speak English. And so, well, then they sent the supervisor, and she spoke really good English, so that she worked it out.
Yeah.
So it's I get, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. I think maybe it happens in encapsulated places. It's kind of a way of white solidarity, maybe.
Yeah. And Todd, that's such a good illustration of the power of language. I have a challenging time just with English. I cannot learn other languages. And I don't usually take the I cannot learn very often, but it is just one of those places where I have a very fixed mindset. I cannot get out of that mindset with other languages. And when I meet non-native English speakers, I am just in awe of how hard they have worked to learn English and to do that. And I think we just come as Americans, because English is it's seen as so powerful, maybe we forget how hard it is to learn another language. And to all people who speak more than one language, you are my idol. I just can't do it.
Well, and that's the thing I think it's so often missed by the white culture. Here at Ivy Tech, a number of years ago in Fort Wayne, we have a fairly large Burmese population.
Yep.
And a gentleman came to Ivy Tech to go to school again because he just wanted to go to school as a life enrichment. He already had advanced degrees from Burma, and he was a democracy protester and had been jailed and beaten. And finally they let him out, and he went back to protesting, and was then horribly, horribly tortured, and he was able to escape the country. Well, long story short, he had some closed head injuries, had everything you could imagine with that kind of experiencing, not to mention a cross-cultural experience of now being in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the reason I bring it up is because I showed interest in his language. And English as a second language was also another, he spoke English, but it was another thing to consider. And a couple days later, he came with a loose leaf binder, and he had written down all these phrases in Burmese and their phrase in English, and gave it to me as a gift. And then when he would come in to see me, would kind of like try to coach me, and you showed some interest here, and I gave you the book, and I'm just like, So anyway, it at least gave me a bigger awareness of what some people are skilled at.
I am an Army brat, and we lived growing up in Germany for 2 separate times for 3 years each. And part of that second language piece, I think, almost feels cultural to me, because in Germany, from kindergarten on, they start learning English. I mean, and it's English that they pick as the second language, but there just seems to be this importance of learning another language. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of research has shown that when you're younger, you pick that up better. You can make those sounds better. Your brain is like a sponge and it absorbs it. And I was just always so impressed that they started that at such a young age. And, I can't speak for the whole K-12 system here, but most places that I've seen don't start looking at foreign or out, second languages until middle school.
Yeah.
And at that point, is there interest? Is there desire?
Right.
So to me that seems kind of cultural.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When I was growing up, my parents were really weird about German language, and they actually did have a bilingual school before grade school. So they put me in that before grade school for me to learn German, which was going to be not really the language of it. I'm like, is this what we think is going to happen? That I'm going to need to know German? But they were gung ho on German, and they really should have found the Spanish school, that was teaching. But for some reason, my dad had spent time in Germany, and they had this affinity like for the German language. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I started learning German in probably second grade, maybe first grade. And I was just thought that was so interesting because other than having friends who are from Germany, that's the only time I've been able to use any language that I picked up. And I didn't learn it that well, but I can read it sometimes and I can understand people. And I just think that's funny that I've had no use for it whatsoever.
That's one of my biggest regrets. I took Spanish from 6th grade all the way through high school, and then I just never did anything else with it. And so one of these days I'm going to enroll in Ivy Tech Spanish 101 and get back up to speed.
Yeah, and I took Spanish in high school and college and even got awards in it. I cannot speak Spanish hardly at all. You wouldn't even believe I took the course.
Yeah, I won a Spanish poetry recitation contest.
Yes, it was completely memory. I remember more German and am still better with German than I would ever be with Spanish, and I took Spanish longer. But it's because I learned the German when I was younger.
Yeah.
I am in Spanish 101 Ivy Tech right now. It's not going so well. That's all I'm going to say. I missed the first assignment due date. First time I ever missed a deadline as a student, so I'm disappointed in myself.
Yeah, I should really take that and not just memorize it, learn it.
Well, maybe we will all start a cohort of Spanish 101 here at Ivy Tech.
There is since we're all maybe potentially going to be a part of a podcast, I discovered a podcast series. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It's Coffee Talk. I think it's called Coffee Talk Language, and it's called that because they're like very brief 5-10 minute mini lessons on Spanish and French and other and hundreds of episodes.
Awesome.
It's a great thing for a commute. If any of you are commuting this semester, I guess I could commute from my bedroom to my office, but I wouldn't even get the episode in. I think that kind of approach is useful, and little bits and pieces here and there, of course.
Absolutely.
Unsolicited, unpaid plug.
That's good. I will put a link to that in the show notes.
One more thing about this chapter, I was thinking about, I taught English in high school and Huckleberry Finn, and how controversial that was, and how, because it used the word, and should it be banned in school or should it be sanitized? And I ended up teaching the original version and just remember how awkward it was, and how hard it was. And I have an attitude that I don't believe in necessarily changing historical books or banning them in dealing with parents. It was just an interesting thing as a really young teacher.
It's an interesting point, Tammy, especially as we consider what we do as professionals. Do you treat history with honesty and say, this is what was written at the time? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why it wasn't appropriate then, why it's not appropriate now. Or do you try to present a cleaned up version of history? And I guess I'm with you. I would rather present it honestly. But what do others think?
I think you should present it honestly. And I think it concerns me when people try to ban films and things that were made from an earlier time.
Yeah.
It's like like that one, the Christmas, maybe it's cold outside. There was a film that had that song in it. Mm-hmm. And, I like old movies, movies that are older than I am. And the idea that they were going to like say, oh, that song's no good and you shouldn't watch the movie the song was in. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, can we please understand that was a different time than now?
Right.
And you don't have to agree with it. The words, you don't have to listen to it, but can we just leave it out there for people who might want to consume it and see it, and get an idea of maybe, what Hollywood was thinking back then, what was okay, what was acceptable. So I'm a fan of, leaving things out there and just, maybe explaining how things were at that time.
And, I agree with that part. And also, if you aren't honest about what happened, and people, younger people who don't know that those things even existed, you can't learn from them if you don't know that things happened or how things were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, my mother-in-law has a friend who moved here from Germany as an adult, and she was never taught, and she's in her early 70s now, she was never taught about the Holocaust. It's not in the curriculum.
Wow. That's amazing. And amazing in a horrible way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things to keep in the front of our minds in history is it's extremely important of who writes it and what their perspective is. Yeah. Oftentimes the victors are the ones that write the history. Use a example from anthropology. The American anthropologists were assuming, like Franz Boas and Alfred Kroeber and such, were assuming that Native Americans were going to go away, that they would be completely acculturated, and that there would never be. So they were doing history because they needed to get this to preserve it, not realizing that it was still alive, though oppressed horribly. The culture actually did survive. And like all things cultural, even Native American religion and practices have evolved and changed over time. Another example would be from the literary field. There's a famous book out called Black Elk Speaks, written by James G. Neidhart. I was able to do some independent study on that book. And to read the book, Neihart's perspective was that Black Elk was kind of not pitiful as a person, but lamenting and struggling and agonizing over the loss of his religion, Oglala Lakota Sioux. And when you really go down to the Western manuscripts collection and you start really digging into the interviews and all that, all of a sudden this light bulb came off. I'm in Columbia, Missouri, and it's like he was doing it. He was doing the ritual right in front of Neihart, and he thought he was giving the cultural material to him as a living, breathing thing, that he was passing down the knowledge.
Yeah.
So I think when we read history, we have to really look at who's writing it and what their perspective is and what is the other, what's the agenda.
That's a good thought to transition to the next chapter on, which is entitled, What is Cultural Appropriation? Because I think we do always have to keep in perspective who's speaking and what's happening there. I'm going to start this chapter with a quote on page 145 of the hardback book. One of the trickiest conversations you're bound to have regarding race in America will likely be about cultural appropriation. While not as charged as racist or privileged, cultural appropriation is a term that carries a lot of emotion and confusion for many people of all races. At its core, cultural appropriation is about ownership of one's culture. And since culture is defined both collectively and individually, the definition and sentiment about cultural appropriation changes with one's identification and sentiment about aspects of their culture.
Wasn't there a recent controversy about a politician having, I can't remember what the item was, racially charged items in his antique shop? Does anybody remember that? I can't remember. It was pretty recent, like a month ago or something.
I think if it's the same story, the minstrel figures, I think were in it.
Yes.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the individual, but I do remember that story.
Yeah, and a group was upset in general that he didn't remove these items from the inventory. So that might be a place to start.
I don't know. I think that's I don't know. I may have heard about that, but I think that's different for me than the cultural appropriation that she's talking about. So, for example,
Okay.
Adele, the singer, decided to wear an African-inspired hairstyle called Bantu knots. And I mean, literally, this just happened. Like the picture just, became viral like yesterday, maybe. And so they not only do they not look good on her, my personal opinion, now she's having to defend why she wore them. I think she has a Jamaican flag on or something too, colors, Jamaican colors. I don't know. But the hairstyle in itself, so people are now accusing her of cultural appropriation because she's wearing a hairstyle that is primarily, women of color and, Black women wear. And now she's wearing it, and so she has some supporters too, according to the article. Some people support her, but a lot of people are giving her grief and about wearing it.
I was even more vague. I just looked it up because I was like, oh, I didn't see that. And I just put in Adele hair and it came. So yeah, that's quite interesting. It's not a look that I really thought Adele would do actually, but, or really anyone in her bikini top. I mean, it just seems very inappropriate on a couple of different levels.
Yes.
Okay, I'm looking it up. I have.
All right.
There'll now be a commercial break while we all Google it.
We totally went sidetracked a little bit while we look on our phones to get the backstory.
But I think that's what she's talking about. Yeah. That's why I brought that up, not to make fun of Adele, because I like her music, but that's what she's talking about. Yeah. And even how she had them done. I know Black women who wear them and they don't look like hers. Mm-hmm. So I don't know who did hers. I don't know.
And I think about that while I'm a big cruise fan, and as we started today, I had the cruise ship in the background, and there's always a hair braiding station on the cruise ship, and you can pay $8,000 to have your child's hair or your own hair braided in. And it always made me feel weird, and I didn't understand why. And now maybe this is it. Like maybe it's a reaction to that cultural appropriation that's happening. I don't know. Or maybe it's just because I think, why would you want to have your hair braided that tall? Because it hurts. I've, having had long hair my whole life and braided it in different ways, I know that it's not real comfortable to have that.
No, it's painful. It definitely is to get the actual, the smaller braids. It's not. Yeah. It's definitely painful. And, as I said, people can wear what they want. I'm not, shaming anyone, but I'm just saying that, sometimes you might need some guidance on what works for you and maybe what doesn't.
That's such a good way to think about it. What else from this chapter?
One of the things I highlighted was perhaps the next page. I'm reading it on my phone, but appreciation should benefit all cultures involved, and true appreciation does. So really just kind of the separation of appreciation versus the appropriation, that, things can be done in good taste, or things can be shown and really kind of praised in different ways, but it's not that it is taken over by the folks who want to show it off and that they're the ones benefiting from it. So I think that sometimes that's where there's some confusion is, well, I really like this, or this is something that is meaningful to me too, because I see the beauty in it, and there can be appreciation. I think that's where there's some confusion for folks who want to say, well, that's not appropriation, it's because I really like it. But that if they're benefiting from really liking it, that's where it takes that next step. So I don't think there's anything wrong with appreciating other cultures. I think that's actually what we're trying to do, but that we're aware of how we're doing it.
That's true. I think that's true.
Yeah, I think it's near there too, maybe another page or so. I'm sorry, I'm on an ebook. But the paragraph begins, the problem of cultural appropriation. I think what maybe the sort of challenge is to make it clear that you want to learn and expand your understanding of a culture while simultaneously not trying to emulate it, or like Americanize it or something like that, or make it yours, because that's where people can get easily want to withdraw. I think of how there's so many American holidays that we are just, it's such a farce. St. Patrick's Day, Cinco de Mayo, like what we do in America for these holidays, it's just another reason to drink and party, and it's a gross like exaggeration and of these and a caricature of their culture, and it's embarrassing as an American to see that happen, and it took a long time for me to realize how offensive that is to those cultures, and I don't want to be a part of perpetuating that either.
I think the topic of holidays are, at least in my experience working with students who are going into education, has been something that's really challenging for them to understand. I had a discussion board once, and it took place in the fall, and it was like we are coming up upon the time of 3 major holidays that may be celebrated in your school: Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. How do you approach this while maintaining, making sure you're providing equal access for all of the students in your classroom? And I had a student who responded that, they're only, they'll talk about it, but that's all they're going to do, and it doesn't really matter. They celebrate Christmas, and, Christmas is it. And I tried to give some examples of, what about, this or this? And they're like, well, we'll just tell them Happy Jewish Christmas. And I was just like, I couldn't just, it was hard to get the students to think about beyond themselves.
And that's it, Sarah. I mean, it's an acknowledgement that you are not the center of the world, that America is not the center of the world. And as an American, you are not the center of the world. That is such a challenge for us in this country.
Yes.
One of you may know, does anyone know the name of that teacher whose videos go around, the teacher of kind of she has a lot of, I guess we'll say, videos on like map making and like cultural appropriation and racism in the class prejudice. I wish I could think of her name. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But I think that her message is consistent and fair, and it is exactly this sort of how in America, primarily, we have adopted this notion of being the center of the world, and it just isn't. It's not right nor accurate or moral, I guess I should say.
I have a world map that is upside down in my office. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it really highlights cartography and how inaccurate it is. And North America always looks bigger than South America, but the opposite is true. And then you flip that upside down. I have it in my office so that I can start having a conversation about some of these things. And it freaks people out. It really does. They're like, you just look at it. And so that's just another piece of the pie and how we think we're the center.
Wasn't that the theme of or part of the theme of a West Wing episode?
One of
the big block of cheese day episodes, I think, was about.
That's exactly right.
How the maps are all.
That's right. I forgot about that. I got this idea from my sister-in-law.
I love it.
So.
I thought the very end of the chapter was really interesting because it talked about who defines what is sacred to a culture, who defines what was born of struggle, who defines what appropriation is and what it isn't. And that makes it very uncomfortable because, anything then could be viewed as cultural appropriation from something. And I think back to, when I was, many years ago, I went to, my sister-in-law was 16 and I went to one of her best friend's 16th birthday party, and she's Indian. She comes from an Indian family. And I just remember thinking, this is so beautiful. I love this. I love the clothing and the music and the dancing and the food. And it got me thinking, and I was like, I don't feel like I have a culture. I don't have a standard style of dress and a standard style of food. And I recently, not recently, it seems like a year now, went to New Orleans, and I was like, I love the culture. I mean, there's just culture and I teach COM 102 interpersonal communication, and we talk about co-cultures. And I mean, so I think that just becomes very muddy, especially when you're looking at cultures within cultures.
Well, I think that goes back to the opening quote. This is hard. This is a hard conversation because culture is defined both by the individual and the group. And so what you might see as appreciative, somebody else might see as appropriation. And that's why I think just conversation is so important to make sure that everybody's clear and comfortable.
All we have to do is think about Halloween costumes.
We do have food culture in Indiana. It's that pizza-sized tenderloin on a regular hamburger thing.
I call it the big as my head tenderloin.
That's right.
Yeah, the world is crazy for those. Yeah, that's what we should be really doing.
And sugar cream pie.
Yes.
Of course, yes.
Yes. I think those tenderloins, that comes from, it's Gnawbone, Indiana, isn't it? Isn't that the little town just outside of Brown County with the gas station that has the tenderloins? Yeah. Only in Indiana. I love this state. I love living here. All right, friends, let's go ahead and go on to chapter 11, which is entitled, Why Can't I Touch Your Hair? And I went for a quote almost at the end of the chapter. It's at the bottom of page 159 after the list of items. And it says, she says, since the first Black Americans were brought over as slaves, our bodies have not been our own. We were objects, property. Our bodies were curiosities and tools to be inspected and exploited. Our bodies were sources of judgment and shame, but they were never beautiful and they were never our own. And it's just painful to read it. And it should be. I mean, as a white person, I should feel a lot of pain to read something like that. So this issue of someone touching a Black woman's hair came up just this past week for me. I'm a big podcast listener, obviously, and I think it was Radiotopia. They've had 4 Black women leave their company in less than a year. And one of them wrote a public letter. And one of the things is that the CEO had walked up to her and touched her hair without asking. And this was in the last 12 months. So this is it is. And I can't fathom doing that. I don't understand.
I think I find that shocking. I have a lot of hair. So my hair, gets a little conversation from time to time. And I did work at a company where I decided to get my hair braided, like cornrows. And my hair's already long, but I had the extensions put into it because I thought it would stay longer and look nicer longer, whatever. That's usually why a lot of people do that. They add the extensions because they want it to stay nicer, longer, etc. So I can remember my boss and then like the director of the company, both white males, and they said exactly the same thing. Because I had never worn my hair like that to work before, they said. And this was probably 6 or 7 years ago. I don't work there now. And he looked at me and he goes, oh, so you got braids? And I was like, yes. And he just shook his head and walked away. And then I went to the other building where his boss was, and his boss said the exact same thing, which I was like, did they have a conversation? Because he said the same thing, which was, oh, so you got braids? Yeah, yes. And I just thought that was so odd that these 2 white males were interested in my hairstyle. Like, and not to say, oh, it looks nice. You got a new hairstyle. It looks nice, which I feel like they would have said to anyone else. Right. For me, it was just this comment, some dead air, and then they walk away.
Yeah.
So I think it's the idea that somebody would touch, like I've never had someone touch my hair who was in a position of authority over me. That's just crazy talk. And when she was talking about people touching her hair, I'm like, who are these people? Because I've never had that happen where somebody in an authority position has come up to me and just put their hands in my hair.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just, when I read it like more than one time, because I'm like, how does this happen? And I've heard other Black women say that it happens to them. And I'm thinking at work, because I can't even fathom it that somebody would do that at work.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion on it. It's crazy to me that somebody would, talking about giving you strange looks. Oh yeah. But touching?
Yeah, keep your hands to yourself. I think is just the rule we should all abide by in this whole thing.
Especially nowadays,
Mm-hmm.
I think. And so it's crazy to me that even with the climate that we live in, with the idea of keeping your hands to yourself, that people are still willing to go up to a Black woman and touch her hair, or even ask to touch their hair. Like, that's just, wow. Yeah. That blows my mind.
My nephew is 5 and he's biracial. And that's one of the things that my sister complains about all the time is when she's out somewhere with him, they will be like, oh, I love his hair. Can I touch his hair? Mm-hmm. And she's like, please don't touch my child.
Right.
And under any circumstances. But people will just walk up at the grocery store and like try to touch his hair. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, one, to anybody's child, but what makes you think you have the right to come up and touch anybody without, permission, or like you said, to even ask?
And I say, especially when you have a hairstyle that is not, like ironed out, blown out, straight, you get comments. Like I get comments if I do anything to my hair that's not pulled back in a ponytail, ironed out, pressed, to where it looks like the ideal that society has taught us to appreciate. I love straight hair. And I know the reason I love straight hair is because those were the images I saw growing up. And, that was what beauty was to me, was straight hair. So anytime I do something to my hair, and apparently other people's as well, because whenever I do something to my hair that doesn't involve it being straight or pulled back in a ponytail, people ask, I get questions all the time, because I'll get my hair twisted, my natural hair twisted. And people will say, oh, so are those extensions? Nope, not extensions. It's still my hair. It's my hair. And so there's a lot of conversation if you're a Black female, and probably Black males too, but in my experience, about your hair. Yeah. It's just always, is that your hair? Yeah, it's my hair. It really, it's like I spend a lot of time talking about whether my hair is my hair. And, it's just, it gets a tad tiring.
Right.
So.
Diane, that gives me a different perspective. I'm thinking of different books I've read by Black women, and Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, Oprah's book, and Shonda Rhimes' book. Just those 3 right off the top of my head that I've read, every single one of them has a chapter on hair. And I don't think that's ever probably been the case with white women. And I don't know if that is just that, if that's our fascination with Black hair. I don't know where that comes from. I had not even thought of that until you were saying that.
And I think what is interesting to me is in celebrity land now, and even regular women now, there are a whole lot of women who are not Black that have extensions now.
Right.
Like that is not uncommon. Any reality show, all those women have extensions, but even in real life, women are getting extensions, and they're not all Black. So my thing is, if you're going to ask me, is that, my hair, which, then are you going to ask, other women who are not Black, is that their hair? Because the likelihood is it might not be their hair. Maybe they have some extensions.
Right.
So, that's the thing. It's a whole thing. I could talk forever on it. So I'll stop. I'll stop now, because it is totally a thing.
Well, and you hit on too, the idealization of beauty in America is white and skinny and blonde, typically. Those are the sort of the idealism of it. And so, that's what all of us, we all want the hair we can't have and the body we don't have, and all of those sorts of things. At least as women, I think that pressure is a little bit more. I won't try to speak for the men, because I can't. Steve and Todd can do that if they want, or they can stay quiet. It's okay.
I think it's funny because I never bought into the body image.
Yeah.
Like I never found that attractive.
Yeah.
Like in terms of somebody being thin, I was like, no, I didn't get, but I definitely got the hair thing. Okay. But not the body image thing, thankfully.
I really appreciate that. And in a moment of complete honesty, back when I was single, I really preferred to date outside of my own race because other cultures seem to have a wider acceptance of what beauty is.
Yep.
And so it was hard for me for the most part because I don't fit into the mold of what a typical beautiful white woman is. And so I was not always the most desirable for typical white men.
Which is so sad because you're a beautiful person.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
But that's one of those things where I admired other cultures so much because they seem to be more accepting in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think also, I think there's a difference between white collar and blue collar. And, as I said, that could be my stereotype. But I also think for some men, and the men can speak to this, that what other people see you with. There's even been some fiction books written about this. Jennifer Weiner.
Love that book, Jemima J.
Yes, and it's like, who do you want your friends? It's like, for the male, is it a thing where they want to be seen with the ideal? That might not be their preference, but is that what you want to be seen with?
Oh.
So only the men could speak to that because I don't know, but that's what I've heard and read over the years.
That's an interesting perspective.
We just covered this in my class this morning, impression management.
So if you're a CEO, white collar male, white, all that going on, and who do you want to be seen with? How do you want to be perceived?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you prefer women who are heavier and look a different way, way more, whatever. But is society going to be okay with you being seen with this person instead of, quote, the societal ideal?
Go ahead, Steve.
How long is this podcast going to be?
I'll rescue you, gentlemen.
No. I was going to say, as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy, it really makes me have to pause and think. At 61 years of age, a lot of things have changed. 99% of it for the good, and I could list some of those things off. But being with this identity, it's best not to talk. No, I really got to share with you that, 35 years ago, if my boss, who was female, came in and had a new hairdo and had lost or gained weight or had some new clothes on, it was very typical to say, "Hey, Joanne, I really think blah, 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 blah." And that was sort of a norm. And especially if you're the dominant, even though she's my superior, I'm a white male, right? I think that, I don't know from Steve's perspective, but I think that's changed a lot more. There's at least, if not true cultural sensitivity, there's just the pragmatic, it's better to keep your mouth shut. It's just off-putting to mention somebody's body type or their hair. I don't know. I guess the reason I get to an impasse is because I've kind of just pulled back and taken a fifth on the whole thing and taken the safe route, which is be quiet.
I mean, my simple answer is I want to be seen with the person I'm in love with, and I couldn't care less. I have no time or patience for people who at my age or anyone who's an adult or claims to be adult would have anything to say about that in that regard. Like, make a judgment based on what I drive or who I'm with. Like, I don't have time for people like that anymore. So yeah. I graduated junior high a long time ago. So
I'm with Steve on that.
Yeah.
I'm all the way. Sometimes it seems like the richer men that I know, I hate to make it a class thing, but sometimes it's a money thing.
Yeah.
There's a phrase we all know about, and I'm not even comfortable saying it, but it starts with trophy.
Mm-hmm.
And that phrase did not get into the culture without
it occurring.
Yeah.
It's funny. My fiance, he's a CFO somewhere, and I was talking to somebody and I said, I don't know if I'm cut out to be a CFO's wife. And my mind went to purely physical.
Mm-hmm.
We go to these events and, these people that look like Barbies, and I'm not Barbie. And the person said to me, "You're exactly who they want as a CFO's wife. You're funny, you're charming, you're outgoing, you're friendly." And that wasn't where my mind went, but that was where their mind went, is more personality based type things. And so I think that just goes to show how there's so much emphasis put on physical, especially from our own perspectives on ourselves, I think.
Absolutely. All right, friends, let's head into the last chapter for today, which is chapter 12. What are microaggressions? And for this chapter, I chose a quote from page 172. It's a little shorter than the other quotes I've used today. Microaggressions are a serious problem beyond the emotional and physical effects they have on the person they are perpetrated against. They have much broader social implications. They normalize racism. They make racist assumptions a part of everyday life. And I will just add here that as I try to learn more about microaggression, that paragraph just summarizes the importance of doing a lot of learning and a lot of understanding about microaggression, because it does, for me, it really is about things that are just accepted in the culture or accepted in a particular workplace or accepted in a particular setting that are really racial, just embedding racism in the culture that we've got to try to eradicate if we're going to truly dismantle racism. So I'll open it up to your thoughts on this chapter.
So to kind of go off the idea of microaggressions, the first thing that I think of is I just finished reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. We did it as a book club book here at the Muncie campus. And I get drawn back to a quote from the book, and I just Googled it real quick because my copy of it's at home. And it says, what other people call racial microaggressions, I call racist abuse. And I call the zero tolerance policies preventing and punishing these abusers what they are, anti-racist. Only racists shy away from the R word. Racism is steeped in denial. So ever since I read that, when I hear the term microaggressions, it makes me think that some people view that as the wrong term to use.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think it depends on, I always say this, it depends on how you were raised, because some things that people call microaggressions, I don't view that way. And I think it's because my relatives, my aunts, my mom, what you heard growing up makes you a little bit more like, that's just someone speaking truth. So I think a lot of it, what you perceive as a microaggression, depends on how you were raised. Because some of the things she mentioned in the chapter, I'm pretty sure my aunt has said to me. So, and she's 90 now. She's the elder of the family. And I'm pretty sure I was like, oh yeah, she said that to me before. So I think it depends on how you were raised, and that affects your perception. Because I'm thinking, I've heard those things from my aunt, who clearly is Black. And, for me, it's just, I took it from her as honesty. So if I heard that from somebody who wasn't related to me, I'm not so sure I would see that as a microaggression. So I think it's perception based.
That small c cultural aspect of microaggression is an interesting one to think about. That within your family, because you heard those terms and they may have even had a note of endearment to you, you might not perceive it that way. But that's a really interesting perspective on microaggression. I don't think she talks about in the chapter, and I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah, and maybe she didn't, get that, but especially the lipstick thing. Oh my goodness. I mean, oh no, I mean, I definitely heard that from my aunt, and, so, any makeup issues, man, eyeshadow, that blue eyeshadow, you can't wear blue eyeshadow. I'm like, oh my goodness. So for those who didn't grow up, with hypercritical relatives, I'm sure microaggressions are really painful, and they're not, for me, as I said, it's just somebody being honest, somebody being blunt, and someone lacking tact.
Yeah.
But I can see how for other people who didn't grow up in that environment, they would see it as, racism and abuse and all of that. I can totally relate to how they could see it that way. And some of them are, don't get me wrong, right. But a few of the ones she mentioned in the chapter, I didn't view that way at all.
I think that's really an interesting point too, because, in speaking with my friends of color who grew up in communities where perhaps the majority of the people there were white, there was that co-culture again of like, I am a Black person or a Latino person, and so I have that culture, but I also have to try to fit in with my white counterparts in the community. And so that fine line between embracing your community, but kind of maybe overlooking some of the things that the white people around you are saying or doing, and so you can fit in with them as well. So just kind of like that balancing act of where you draw the line.
Yeah. Amanda, for that, I want to go back to what Sarah said about just sort of, I'm going to say something and it may not be the right thing. And that's because this is a safe space with all the people that are listening to us too. I want to take the sting off the word racist so that we can have an honest conversation about what it means to be racist. That we all do things that are racist. And I don't think that's a statement that's limited to white people. I think people of all races do things that are racist, but we, as she talked about at the beginning of the book, we try to reserve that word for the sort of big things, the really bad things. And I think as we think about microaggressions, we've got to start to think about the small details and the relationships we have and how words, connecting back to the earlier chapter, how words we use matter. And we've got to have relationships in order to understand the impact that those words have on each other. I don't know.
I think that goes to what she said in this chapter of how it's called a microaggression. It's a micro. Yeah. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Well, I think Kendi to me is a really quality read, and he wants us to talk about definitions of words and microaggression. He also, this Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind, talks about there is no such thing as a microaggression because aggression is not unintentional and an accident. So I think we are looking at definitions of what do we mean by this. And I think it was you, Dr. Monroe, that mentioned it. I think most of the authors are trying to get us out of this. Yeah, a lynching is a horrible event, but what we're really looking at is 400 years of history, not just about you and what you did or didn't do. I mean, a white person does something that's obviously racist and we go, oh, that's bad, and they're a bad person. I think the authors are telling us to get out of that rut. Good people can be racist.
Yeah.
Unintended. I mean,
Yeah.
So I guess we're all trying to develop a language around that. That's what's so hard about talking with another white person is if you say racist, well, I never did anything, and they'll list off a bunch of things.
Yeah.
They don't take any ownership about white privilege and the systemic problems we have.
My parents they'll both be 80 by I think the time this episode airs. My mom turns 80 this month. And my dad has attended, I think, 2 Black Lives Matter rallies in Richmond where they live. And it's just caused us to have some really good conversations. And of course, we now do all of our calls this way, like on a Facebook Messenger. So I see his face and we can have better conversations. And it's, as we started talking at first about it, and I would use the word racist to describe a word or something, he would, you'd see that. And as we've just talked about it more, and he's relaxing and we're having more deep and more honest conversations. And I mean, I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form in trying to dismantle racism. I'm just trying to learn along with others. But it's been good to watch that relaxation and to be more comfortable talking about how we need to grow and how we need to change. And it is hard to have those conversations, though.
And I think, so I went to a school that was predominantly white. I went to a private school, for a really long time. It was like a K through 12. And I went there from 5th grade until I graduated. So there weren't that many other Black people there. So in my class of 60, my graduating class of 60 people, there were 5 Black people, including, me. I'm one of the 5.
Right.
And I think that also has affected how I view things as well, because so when people talk about tanning, that's a big thing. You're almost as dark, I'm almost as dark as you. I'm almost, they got tan. And I never saw that as a microaggression. I mean, I'm sure it was, but I didn't see it that way because honestly, the people seemed thrilled that they could get brown. That was the goal. The goal was to be nice and tan and brown. So I didn't see that as a negative. I was like, oh, look, they're pleased with themselves because they got brown. and they're hoping it lasts a long time. So I didn't really see that was negative because they wanted to be tanned.
Mm-hmm.
Like they enjoyed that. They didn't want to be pasty. Their words. I don't want to be pasty all summer. I want to be brown. I want to be tan. So I just never saw that as being negative towards me. Clearly they weren't my color, and they could stay out in the sun for a very long time and would not be my color. So I didn't see that as, oh, gee, look, they're putting me down. I'm like, they're pleased that they got a good tan. And that's how I saw it. So I don't know if that's because I spent so much time in this environment. There were things that they did that I did see, as that way, because they would say, oh, are you on scholarship? No, my parents pay for this.
Right.
So don't assume, and they paid all those years. Don't assume because I'm someone of color that I'm getting to come here for free.
Yep.
So that I did see as an aggression, probably more than a microaggression. That really irritated me. Yeah. So that was something that I did see as being, and it didn't happen the whole time. It only happened when I first got there. Mm-hmm. And then they figured out, oh yeah, her parents are paying for her to be here. But to even question that way as a child, that wasn't cool.
So intention and perspective matter as we have these conversations. It's a really good point. Anybody want to have the last word for this chapter or for today's discussion?
I would like to, I think it was near the end, end of 12, where in the series of like suggestions or whatever, this sort of, I feel like this harken back to, I believe, an earlier statement about how these conversations can go badly. Yeah. And when I see that line about don't force people to acknowledge your good intentions and, trying to like continuously just accept and own that you made a mistake, right? And no one needs the lengthy description of, the history of your thinking and your train of thought. Just, hey, I get it. I will do better next time or something along those lines. That seems simple enough and respectful enough, because the longer you go, you're just returning it back on you, how you are somehow the victim of your own comment.
We've talked about the practicality of this book, and I do think, Steve, I'm glad you pointed that out. The section at the end where she does talk about when someone tells you you've done this, how do you react to it? And I think earlier in the book, she said, don't rewrite your story of it as the time you got yelled at. And I think you said that so beautifully, that make sure the story that you take is honest of, I made a mistake. I like that. Other final thoughts on today's conversation, my friends?
Just don't touch anyone.
Your hands to yourself.
Your hands to yourself.
I do have a few things in the chat that Jane Elliott, and I put a short YouTube clip that happens to do with the mapping thing that maybe I think someone else mentioned.
Perfect.
And that very early on, the language podcast was called Coffee Break, not a Coffee Talk.
I will make sure both of those get in the show notes. Excellent.
Right. But yeah, another great session. Thanks, Kara, for running this.
Oh, thank you all. Thank you very much. All right, everybody. I will see you again and for one more session.
Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can connect with me on Twitter at KNM Tweets. You can reach us by email at ourcollegeorvoices@ivytech.edu. Leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. Don't forget, if you're an Ivy Tech faculty or staff member, you can always join our Microsoft Teams listener community. Our website is ivytech.edu/podcast. Production assistance for this and every episode provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah Ferguson, and the Ivy Tech Community College marketing team. Our podcast concept is by Matthew Pittman. Theme music and post-production services are provided by Jen Eads at the Brassy Broadcasting Company. We'll talk to you next time on Our College, Your Voices.